If you want to help Myth Vision Podcast grow, you can join our Patreon. There are different tiers, as well as help out with PayPal. Thank you so much. Don't forget to like, subscribe, share, and comment. Austin O'Keefe, or Keeffe, not sure how to pronounce that, could be butchering it. Most people, Dr. Bob, say the Gospels were written between 70 and 100 CE. But if we only have Gospels from the 2nd century or later, how do they know the original date of the Gospels, or how can they prove it?
Well, I'd say we only have manuscripts, which is what I think he means, from the early 3rd century, 200 and afterward. And I think the conventional dating is really, perhaps unwittingly, apologetics. They'd like, conservative scholars would like to minimize the distance in time between a historical Jesus and their own day. And just like the ancients did, the bishops of the Catholic Church, who said that you Gnostics are just winging it, you're making it up as you go along, which was true, by the way. They'd have these visions and so on. I mean, that is so clear in something like the Apocalypse of James, or was it the Secret Book of James, where it says we apostles were hanging around looking for visions, and Jesus appeared to us. I mean, they're admitting, yeah, they all subjective. Well, that is dangerous in the sense that you can't have a stable community that way, as the history of Pentecostalism has shown. So the people like Irenaeus said, look, we don't have to worry about that. We know we've got the true doctrine, not because of visions, though visions are all right, Paul had one, but because the 12 it came right out of the horse's mouth. They were the witnesses of Jesus. I think Tertullian and others said this too. We know what he said. In fact, this comes up with acute clarity also in the Pseudo-Clementines, where Peter and Simon Magus, who is obviously supposed to be Paul, they dispute over grace and the Torah. And Simon says, well, the world was made by angels, not by God, and you don't need to keep the law to be saved. That's purely a matter of grace. That's surprising. And this is the false doctrine, according to the author. And Peter says, where do you get the gall to say you're an apostle of Christ and you know his teaching? We were with him. We know what he said. You're just having some kind of hallucination. And I'm hardly paraphrasing. I mean, it's very blunt and clear. And so it was best for them to have a short distance between Jesus and the apostles and the bishops of their day, because the telephone game thing, the more time there is for transmission, the more garbled it's going to get, which is why Martin Luther rejected tradition as a source of authority. He said, well, in theory, good point, but there's just way too much polluted water under the bridge. You think Jesus taught about indulgences and relics? I don't think so. Well, that's what they wanted to avoid, and I think conservative New Testament scholars are doing the same thing. They want to say, oh, there wasn't that much difference. Some people have even, like, I think C.C. Torrey even said that he thought the Gospels were written only about 10 years after Jesus, which I think is absurd, but and he was a great scholar. But most can't really bring themselves to say that, and because of the Jerusalem thing in the Olivet Discourse, given their conservative bent, I'm not sure why that makes any difference to them, since they always say Jesus, what's stopping Jesus from being able to predict the future? So in that case, who
cares when it was written?
Yeah.
He still predicted the future according to them. Yeah.
But it comes in handy for giving even that early a date by saying, well, this must have been written because of this must have been recorded, when other things weren't, because of its currency at the time. That's the Olivet Discourse may have been, but not the whole gospel necessarily. But they want to say, okay, that's the stake in the ground. That's the earliest and the latest it would have been written. And then Matthew and Luke, written within a decade. And though some more of them will push it a little bit later, but that's still the standard thing, 80 to 90. Mm-hmm. And what about John? Well, they hate to reject the old traditions of the church because they depend on them, like with Papias, who said that Mark's gospel was written down by Mark, a disciple of Peter. So that would enable them to push that back to the 60s, right? So they don't want to reject what Irenaeus says, I think it's Irenaeus, about John, because if that's wrong, the other one might be wrong. And the tradition says that John wrote about 100 when he was an old man. He was still around because he must have been a kid when he was a disciple. So he wrote to augment the others. He must have read the other Gospels and said, well, good, but there's more to be said, just like at the end of, if I recorded everything Jesus said, we'd never get out of here. Mm-hmm. So these are sort of largely external criteria. I don't buy it because I think all of those early traditions are worthless, and you can see that quickly when you see what else these people thought. For instance, Irenaeus thought that Jesus was about 50 when he died, and died in the reign of Claudius, not Tiberius, as the other Gospels have. Papias said that Judas Iscariot exploded to death, which is kind of what Acts says. He burst open, though you can translate that as fell headlong. But why would that? I mean, I've fallen headlong in the house here. It didn't kill me. It probably means he exploded like Antiochus or one of these Old Testament bad guys did. In fact, it looks like it's based on that story. And but what happened? When did he do this? Well, it wasn't immediate, Papias says. He swelled up before popping. He swelled up to the proportions of something like a Thanksgiving Day parade float, so that he couldn't even get through two buildings on the side of the street, and he was pissing worms. And old Papias says, yeah, that's what happened. Get out of here. It just is so ridiculous. You think this guy is a worthy source?
I think Dr. Carrier mentioned something briefly about Papias where he says there's a dispute somewhere in there, and he says, I would much rather go off eyewitness than written testimony or something like. Yeah. So he'd rather hear your subjective position than any type of documented tradition that's been written. It seemed like that.
Though he liked oral histories, so to speak.
I mean.
Yeah, he would like to get it from the mouth of those who saw.
Right.
He didn't trust the written records, which apologists do. I mean, they disagree with them there. In fact, it sounds very much like the preface to Luke. He says, yeah, a lot of stuff has been written about this, but I have carefully checked it from the beginning. What did those who were eyewitnesses of the word say? And that doesn't imply they were his contemporaries. It sounds almost exactly like Papias. And so if you just dump that, it's interesting in its own right, but what's his name, the great historian, I can't believe I've forgotten this, the idea of history. Anyway, he says there is such a thing as a history of propaganda. That's why some of the stuff reported is not necessarily true. They weren't just mistaken, they're rewriting the past. And I would say that's what they're getting. But why would we think it was written later than these dates? Well, for one thing, the Gospel of Mark seems to presuppose several delays of the parousia. Of course, we've seen that in our own day. People, he's coming next week, I tell you. And then it passes and they rationalize it away, or they commit suicide, as one group did in the 90s when it didn't materialize. And we know there's a whole history of people jumping the gun like this. And so each time, like there are things like there's this generation will not pass away before all these things happen. That's at the end of the Olivet Discourse, Mark 13. But already it says, this is going to happen, that's going to happen, but the end is not due yet. That already is a way of saying, now you don't jump the gun because these things have happened and nothing, and no parousia. And then it goes on for a bit and it says, first the gospel must be preached to all nations. Has that happened yet? And that seems to be a way of saying, don't get excited until this mission is finished. So it seems to be a correction, like Luke specializes in. He's got 3 different things where people think the kingdom is going to arrive any minute. He says, hold on there. And get to that, I guess, more in a second. But then you've got this this thing before the transfiguration, where Jesus says, there are some standing here who will not taste death until they see the kingdom come with power. Well, twice elsewhere in the New Testament, that the phrase in power or with power is connected with the resurrection of the dead. So that's apparently what he means. But then what happens? 6, 7, 8 days, depending on which gospel you read, he goes up the mountain of transfiguration with Peter, James, and John, and they see his heavenly form. And then they go back down and he looks normal again. What happened there? Well, it seems to me Mark has taken that originally separate story. It might have been a resurrection appearance. He has placed it after this statement of Jesus to provide a historical fulfillment. That, it did happen, it just isn't what we thought, which is exactly what the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Millerites and others have said. Oh, we did have the right date, but the wrong description of what would happen. So seeing the transfigured Jesus in an angelic form, that's the coming of the kingdom. You've got a foretaste of it. You've got a brief vision of it. And why only Peter, James, and John? It's never explained, but that's because only some standing here will see it. The other ones are just waiting at the bottom of the mountain. So it looks like you have to reckon with several delays of the parousia that Mark is looking back on. I can't see that covering only 40 years. I suppose it's possible, but it seems to me that that's easily enough time to view as sort of an accordion for the gospel that is not telescoped, but rather in reverse. The time frame has had to be expanded. Now this, you almost don't even need that if Hermann Dettering of blessed memory was right when he argued that it looks, if you compare Mark 13 with Matthew 24, his version of the apocalyptic discourse, that the things predicted in general terms correspond pretty closely to the events surrounding the defeat of Jerusalem by the Romans in 136 AD, not 70 AD, because it happened twice. The second one was the crusade to defeat Bar Kokhba, the Messiah. And because there's specific things about a famine and an earthquake and all that, he says, from what we know in Josephus, etc., some of these things didn't really happen under the Vespasian Titus conquest, but they did later on with Bar Kokhba. And this is if you look at Matthew's version. Well, wasn't Matthew based on Mark? Well, yeah, but it looks like even in Mark, this is a different document that's been included by the original author of Mark or not. There are arguments on both sides. And it may be that the original document was itself available to Matthew, just as Mark's gospel was, and he decided to go back to the original. Now, of course, you know there are people that say this about the synoptics in general, that Matthew had Luke to use, Matthew had Mark to use, and then Luke had both Mark and Matthew and would go back and forth. I mean, that could have happened too. I don't think so, but it's a viable possibility in the same way here. So if the basis of Mark 13 stemmed from 136, bingo, Mark is a second century document, which I think it is anyway because of the parousia delays. Luke, there's a truckload of considerations that would place it in the second century. But just one thing to stick with the parousia thing, when he has the thing that happens before the transfiguration, he says, some standing here will not taste death until they see the kingdom of God having come. He eliminates with power. Why is that? Just running out of ink or something? Well, as Conselman showed in the theology of St. Luke, you can see little omissions and changes like that throughout the Gospels, and they form patterns where you can see, yeah, this guy was up to something. He's trying to create a subtly different impression. It's not just coincidence or luck. Well, that's especially true in this one, because then you have Jesus eventually give this parable about the man who I think this is his parable of the minas, where the king entrusts to his servants amounts of money and says, trade with these till I return, and we'll see how you did. And then he goes away for a long time, a long way away, to be made king by the emperor. And this is like a fictionalizing of what happened when Herod Antipas coveted the title his father had had of king and went to see, I think, Caligula, and not Caligula, I forget who, but the current emperor, and he got turned down and came back in a foul mood. And one reason was the Jews had sent an embassy saying, Your Highness, whatever you do, don't make this guy king. He's bad enough now. And he knew that and was pretty steamed. Okay, what happens in the parable? The king gets back from being far away for a long time. And he says that those jerks that didn't want me as king, bring him in here and kill him. I need some entertainment. So what's that about? Well, Luke actually prefaces the parable saying there were people in Jesus' entourage that were convinced the kingdom was coming right away. And so to throw cold water on this, Jesus, let me tell you about the king, or the whatever, who went far away for a long time, and he is eventually coming back. Well, that's him in Luke's much altered version. And it's saying, don't think that he's coming quickly. Of course, Jesus didn't say this. This is Luke telling his readers. And then in Acts chapter 1, when he's taught these blockheads for 40 days, the inner secrets of the kingdom of God, they still don't get it, which shows the artificiality of the whole story. And they say, gee, Lord, it's not the time you're going to restore the kingdom to Israel? And, Jesus face palms, rolls his eyes, and said, look, the dates and times the Father has set is none of your damn business. You just get busy preaching the gospel. Isn't it obvious? It can't be the apostles after the resurrection, given the way Luke sets it up. We got the advanced course for over a month, and we're still don't know the most fundamental thing. So it's obviously artificial. And the point again is to say, now don't get the idea. It's just like 2 Thessalonians versus 1 Thessalonians. Like he's coming tonight in 1 Thessalonians and 2 Thessalonians. Where'd you ever get the idea? He's coming soon. Don't you remember? It can't happen until this and that and the other thing happen. It's the same sort of deal. And again, I say this throws Luke into the middle of the 2nd century. Matthew, I won't go into that, but there's stuff there. And John, the whole idea of the realized eschatology of John, you don't say stuff like that. Oh, it's now. And you don't say that unless you've given up on the futuristic eschatology. And John had. Now, I know the ecclesiastical redactor came in and added a few passages, but it's very clear. Lord, what has happened that you're not going to show yourself to the whole world, but only to us? Oh, I thought every eye shall see him. What happened? Your brother shall rise. Oh, I know he'll rise with everybody else on the last day. No, I am the resurrection. And that whoever believes in me will never die, in some sense. Now they wish that that's what it said in Genesis with Adam and Eve, but here it's pretty obvious. You have eternal life qualitatively now. There's another one in there too. The hour is coming, and now is, when the dead will hear the voice of the Son of God, and those who hear will live. The redactor could see what that meant. The Gnostic idea that resurrection is now.
It sounds like Ephesians 2, you were dead in your trespasses and sins type thing as well. That's a Gnostic.
But not anymore, right? And same thing with Colossians. Since you have been raised with Christ, think on the things that are above. Yeah, that's the Gnostic thing, and it's because they got tired of waiting. This can't be right. We made a wrong turn in Albuquerque. And so you retool the whole thing. And I say this means the Gospels were written not long before Irenaeus says there can only be 4 of them. They're not really reliably quoted in anything. Schmidthal speaks of their almost apocryphal nature in the most of the 2nd century. It's like nobody knows them. And it just seems to me it's fantasy to say they're 1st century documents.
With that being said, I want to end on this real quick question. You don't even have to really answer it, but maybe you have a book on mind. You dealt into the eschatological approach to the kingdom and the resurrection, all this stuff. You know I love this kind of stuff. But are there anachronisms in the text we have? And of course I'm sure the rejection of this idea of it being late would just be like, well, when they wrote this, they had their own terms that they were using that were contemporaneous to the times of the speaking people who are copying these things. They might have put their own little touch on things, and therefore those are your anachronisms. But
well, they did, but that's the ecclesiastical redactor who's trying to erase the futuristic expectation. There were tamperings with the texts, real early.
I guess my question would be, do we have, really, to try and give an earlier date on some of the stuff, we would need stuff, I would think, in the language itself that show its early material. Do we have that, or is it all redacted to a point where what we would look at would be anachronistic to 1st century, and there's no way it could be 1st century? I mean, is there you know what I'm talking about? Like, you're saying 2nd century, late 2nd century, 3rd century is what we have in terms of manuscripts. If it was developed in the 2nd to 3rd century, has the language changed so much that what we have shows no evidence of 1st century at all? So there's no way to prove, based on what we have written in there's no way to sift out 1st century real evidence.
Yeah, that's a good question. Some people have argued that there is, like John A.T. Robinson argued that John has historical tradition in it because, not that it was necessarily written that early, but that it's based on material it was. That's almost as good. And he says, well, nobody is in the whole New Testament actually mentions the destruction of the temple as a bygone event, but that seems to me special pleading. It's so obviously in view and all over the place. But he also says there's archaeological information, like Indiana Jones discovered the 5 porticos of the healing shrine at Bethesda or Bethsaida or whatever, and Gabbatha, the pavement on which Pilate set up his throne for judgment. They've discovered that. And F.F. Bruce said that the book of Acts gets the titles of various officials in the different cities of the Mediterranean visited by Paul correct. And so that must be contemporary. Well, he gets one of them wrong, actually. He speaks of the plural politarchs in one city, and there was only one at a time. And the thing is, like, if we know these things all these centuries later, you can't say that nobody would have remembered it or kept it around even in the 2nd century. And the same thing with these places in Jerusalem. There, like, for one thing, there are, you have to point out that tour guides take people to what was supposed to be the tomb of Jesus or what was supposed to be Golgotha. We don't even know if that's right. I mean, what was her name? Helena, the queen mother of Constantine. She sent people over to find these locations, and it was like pin the tail on the donkey. Well, this might fit. Guess this could be the one. And that was William Albright's approach to biblical archaeology too. It's just been exploded, and so we don't even really know that these things that might be the healing shrine, I don't think we know that, but even if we do, it doesn't matter. I mean, was it a surprise that people remembered what the temple was? I mean, nobody would say that.